Hello everyone, my name is Mary Ann Fife. I'm a Senior Project Coordinator and Learning Designer at the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. Our institution, the University of Cape Town, recently adopted D2L Brightspace as its new digital learning platform, and we rebranded it Amathuba, which means openings, chances, opportunities, and prospects in one of our local languages. Although Amathuba only officially began its rollout at the beginning of 2023, which is the start of the academic year at UCT, January, February, we already find that there are opportunities to reflect critically around issues of access and accessibility as it relates to the platform usage. So we're going to be discussing some of the contextual themes related to access and accessibility, specifically issues related to mobile access and language access. In our context, the cost of mobile data, the widespread penetration of mobile phones in South Africa, as well as the fact that we have 12 official languages, including sign language, all contribute to the importance of issues of language and mobile access when we're talking about platform accessibility. So I'm joined by 3 members of our learning design team here at the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, who have all worked on the Amathuba platform, and they'll be sharing some of their experiences. First up, we've got Mishka Reddy, who has broad interest in the field of access, inclusivity, decolonial pedagogies, and student success. We have Diann Selman, who has taught in a course that used very interesting trans-languaging pedagogies, which of course we know is very important in our context. And then we have Benedict Leteane, who has personal experience using a screen reader to navigate the Amathuba platform. He also developed a set of guidelines for staff to develop more accessible courses on the platform. And his experience, of course, is informed both by his experiences as a blind person as well as a learning designer. So Mishka, let me start with you. What are some of the considerations around access and accessibility in our context that may be different from a North American or European context, for example?
Well, thanks for that question, Mary Ann. I think what's unique about our context is that our work is set against the backdrop of apartheid and colonial legacies. And after apartheid in 1994, higher education was seen as an instrument for transformation. And so UCT and other historically white universities have been making a lot of progress around diversifying their student body. But there exists a tension, which is that transformation is not as simple as just access in terms of admissions. What we saw in 2015 and 2016 with the student protests was that there was a call for not just having a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. And this is really about epistemological access in ways of knowing in a discipline and knowledge. And what this highlights for us is that a tension around the fact that teaching and learning values and norms, academic literacies, and even knowledge itself is not neutral. There's also a huge celebration for diversity around culture and around the diversity in language, but a tension that exists at our institution and other higher education institutions in South Africa is that instruction is primarily in English. We're also an institution that are proponents for digitally enabled learning, and yet we have really high data costs and poor internet connectivity and power outages of 2 to 4 hours, sometimes every day. So the tension that exists is meeting those transformational aspirations around teaching and learning, staffing, governance, student wraparound support services with contextual realities. And that's what makes and shapes access and accessibility for us.
Thanks, Mishka. Those are such important points that you raise. And you raised a number of issues, and I hope that our audience gets a sense for our context with that introduction that you gave. One of the issues of access that you mentioned was language. And with that, Di, I'd like to move on to you. Di, what are some of the important issues around, or rather, let me frame that differently. Why is language such an important issue of access in our context? Can you give us a sense for why that is?
Well, thank you, firstly, Marianne, for that question. So linguistic accessibility in classroom scenarios is crucial in our context, particularly for Indigenous language learners. So facilitating comprehension and encouraging academic vocabulary acquisition, and also providing alternative methods for content literacy is definitely a priority in our South African context. The hegemony of English privileges many in South Africa, and it definitely disadvantages those who are Indigenous language speakers. So originally, non-English language students hesitate to engage in classrooms for fear of peer judgment or biases of their intellect or assumed lack thereof. Based on the mastery or memorization of the English language, which, as we know, is our academic monolingual norm. So captions and transcripts help alleviate this problem, and of course are an important part of safeguarding against our students lagging and being left behind. So linguistic challenges extend beyond the verbal, and as an institution which is committed to decolonizing not only our curricula, but also our teaching practices, having easily integrated assistive technologies, tools, and software for translating, because as we unfortunately know, D2L does not incorporate our 12 South African languages. Captioning and transcribing in any of our official languages will reflect our endeavors as UCT to empower and to support our students, particularly those for whom English is a second language.
Thank you, Di. And I think that's also why Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is so important in our context. And we need to be thinking about these issues not only as issues of access, but in our context, it's issues of design. And we hope that as we move on, the platform can support some of our design choices when it comes to issues of language access. But I'd like to move in or zoom into the individual now. And Benny, I'm looking at you. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of navigating Amathuba or navigating platforms through your assistive technology, your screen reader?
Oh, sure. Thank you so much for the question, Marianne. So far, I've had an interesting experience navigating the Amathuba with my screen reader as a blind person, as rightfully saying. You know, since interacting with the platform, I sort of realized that two main issues relating to online accessibility have been prioritized. And here I'm talking about the access to the platform itself, and most importantly for me, will be accessing the learning materials that are on the platform. And you might be asking, what's important? I think it's important for me because if the site or the platform is not compatible with my screen reader, I'll struggle to even to get to a single page. But what is interesting about this new platform that we have is that it has features which enable universal access. And here I'm talking about user customization, which will enable anyone, regardless of disability, to change the settings to suit their own specific needs. Keyboard navigation for a person like myself who depend more on keyboard to navigate the screen. And of great significance lately, what I've discovered is that the site has a built-in accessibility checker, which will allow the course designer and course convener to be able to check if what they've created is accessible to all the students. And this would include things such as PDFs, Word document, as well as images. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that, Benedict. I'm conscious now that we've been talking a lot about the challenges and the issues of accessibility around the platform, or in general, really. But I'd like to switch gears slightly and move into the opportunity space. Where are the opportunities? Where are the possibilities? And I'd like to start with you, Di. I know you spoke about earlier, and so did Mishka, about interesting translanguaging pedagogies. And I'd like you to share some of those examples that you have experienced and that you are aware of, really, because I think that's interesting. That will be interesting for our audience to hear about.
Thank you, Marianne. So a few courses, particularly in the humanities faculty at UCT, have integrated translanguaging as an educational approach to allow our students to communicate their thinking around and to indicate their understanding of the curricular content by running the gamut of our African linguistic expression. So an example of this would be a first-year introductory course, which is aimed at students from non-English speaking backgrounds. The instructor prioritized class activities, including verbal dialogues in the lecture theatres, online and small group discussions, which explored textual and conceptual meanings through the lens of these students' cultural backgrounds. So what the instructor would do would be to pose questions in English and then providing examples in, for example, isiXhosa, require the students to respond by critically reflecting on their own cultural repositories and then using any of our 12 South African languages or a combination thereof to contribute their responses. Essays could also be written in any South African language, which was quite exciting, and supporting materials which use other dialects could also be included in those essays. Online tasks were also translanguaged. This teaching strategy, I think, allowed students to be co-creators and contributors to their own learning, which is pretty critical. In two undergraduate courses, we have a psychology course as well as an accounting course. The instructors created multilingual glossaries for their students where they provided a word or a concept definition in English, and they tasked their students with writing definitions of these terms in one of their own South African mother tongues, using, of course, an academic tone. The results of applying such languaging techniques was seen in the course evaluation feedback of these courses, which revealed that traversing between languages created an inclusive learning atmosphere where students wanted to actively participate because they felt that their languages were valued. They felt that there was no language prejudice whatsoever, and they felt as well like their cultural backgrounds were being celebrated in these instances, which of course removes any class barriers in an instance like this. The relevance of translanguaging in a South African higher education context for us is not just a simple matter. It is a social justice and pedagogical framework's necessity to ethically respond to language discrimination and to move toward the decolonization of courses. This also requires, of course, our staff to be willing to be flexible and to change up their hiring practices, to ensure, of course, that we have staff diversity that mirrors our demographic spectrum within South Africa.
Thanks, Di. Even though I've heard about those examples before, it really does give me sort of the warm and fuzzies because it feels like it really does speak to student-centered design, which feels like leaps and bounds since when I was a student.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I really do like hearing about those examples. And we've been talking about, as you mentioned, Mishka, access for success, and that's really what this is about. So I'd like to ask you another question, Mishka. You spoke and focus a little bit more on the student. How do you think better flexibility of access, particularly mobile access, might contribute to student success?
Well, there are many definitions of student success. It depends on who's asking and through what lens, but using Di's examples of translanguaging practice here at UCT, it's a real indication that flexibility in terms of design, in terms of method and approach, really does encourage student engagement. And the reality of South Africa is that 70% of South Africans have access to a mobile device. So leveraging that, and in terms of flexibility and access, means that students can access their learning materials whenever, wherever, and however they would like. By creating flexibility in this way, we are creating opportunities for reimagining teaching in the physical space. Diverse types of learning materials can also be used. We can also engage in innovative engagement practices and peer-to-peer engagement. But also, as Benedict mentioned, there's opportunities for tools for accessibility, like inbuilt accessibility checkers.
Thank you, Mishka. And all this work that we do with students is really, really important. But at SILT, our work also focuses on staff and enabling staff. And part of that work is to help staff to make their courses more accessible. And so, Benedict, I'd like to come to you now and ask about whether you can mention some of the highlights of the guideline that you developed for staff and making their courses more accessible.
Let me start off by saying, Marianne, that at the moment we don't have legislation that enforces universal access to online learning in South African higher education. But we have an inclusive education policy which sort of support and encourage inclusive learning. But the challenge is that when we come students with disabilities, sometimes we grapple to get access to online learning or online platforms. So as a result, here at SILT, we have decided to adopt the principles of web accessibility from WCAG, which stand for Web Content Accessibility Guideline, to raise awareness about equitable access to online learning. We were sort of looking at ways in which we could create courses that are more accessible to all of our students. Now, these guidelines provide strategies for designing and creating web content as well as websites that are accessible to all of our students. Our aim was rather to enlighten our colleagues about international standard in as far as web accessibility is concerned.
Thank you. This has been a really great discussion. And before we close, I'd like to give anyone who wants to the opportunity to share some thoughts on how we as learning designers can advocate for some of the principles, some of the practices that we've been talking about, if anyone wants to answer.
I'll go, Marianne. So we have been developing a framework it's based on the UDL principles, and it's basically to promote the inclusive curricula and digitally enabled learning for our multifarious student body at UCT. So this initiative is one way we hope to encourage inclusivity by partnering with lecturers in assisting them with creating deliberately equitable learning materials, because that's a key component, and obviously with coherent learning outcomes, which acknowledge all student needs to ensure that everybody has access and everybody is able to participate.
Yeah, and on that point, the UDL is really exactly as you say, Di, about designing for all. So not making provisions for some students on top of what is the regular instruction, but starting from the design process, considering all. And one way as a learning designer that we can help lecturers in envisioning what that could look like is to get them to think about student profiles, getting to know their students, what are the interests of their student body, what are their needs, do they come with prior knowledge, what are potentially temporary or permanent challenges, and then use that as a starting point in the design process.
I like that.
I completely agree with Mishka about knowing your student, because as I said earlier on, that what I love about the platform is that that concept of user customization, to me, it plays a critical role in as far as UDL is concerned, because you as a lecturer, you might not know everything about your student, but your student can be able to go to the platform and try to see how can they make the platform work for them.
Thanks, Benny. And in our context, one of the important considerations, which I don't know if we mentioned earlier, but we've got classes sometimes in excess of 1,000 students. So for us, it's not really about getting to know each student so much as it is about designing universally for access and for accessibility of all our students. And with that, I think we're going to close. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Mishka, Di, Benny. We haven't really focused a lot on the platform itself, but I hope that through having these conversations about our context, that our audience will also start to have these conversations in their context. So thank you. I think that this has been a very rich discussion. I hope that we inspire our audience to have similar discussions in their contexts. And in so doing, we can move the platform features forward and at the end of the day, create more accessible courses for all of our students.